morning. This is part 3 of the Introduction to Cultural Studies lecture series, and today we'll start discussing the concept of material culture, so a special type of culture, and in the later part of today's lecture we'll talk about art, especially British art, and the divisions in British art chronology, so something that you will probably find useful during the course of your studies. So let's start from the very beginning. What could be the elements of culture? There are different ways of approaching that. One of the more popular distinctions is into artifacts, concepts, and behaviors. Yes, that's my cat, Watson. There are 3 cats somewhere here, and you may end up looking at them. So here's part of nature rather than culture here, but culture can be divided into artifacts or objects, so material culture, but also some non-material things such as concepts, ideas, beliefs, values, ethical norms, and also behaviors such as, I don't know, dances or social customs and such things. You may ask yourself whether animals have any elements of culture. Possibly, yes, why not? I don't think humans are so much different from other animals. I think it's just the matter of degree. I'm not a biologist. You can find quite a lot of interesting information about it in books or online, but there are strong suggestions to assume that animals have forms of culture. Animals can communicate with each other and also with humans, like Watson here. He can communicate all right. Some animals make or use tools. Here you can see an ape, probably a chimpanzee, using a simple stick to get to some food, probably some larvae in an insect nest. Some primates learned to use symbols, especially if they were raised by humans and they were instructed by humans, so they could communicate with the human caretakers using various symbols. It is debated what level of consciousness and self-awareness animals have. Probably they have some sort of self-consciousness. There are many very interesting theories about that. Animals can experience emotions, they can experience pain, they can experience various states that are similar to them and to humans, like, I don't know, fear or hunger, but it's again the matter of degree. Humans, at least as much as we know it now, are the only animals that can experience more complex emotions and whose life is a constant and diverse interaction with a variety of things, all kinds of things, textiles, furniture, utensils, books, films, houses, cars, whatever. So some animals, especially more complex animals such as mammals and especially primates, have some form of self-awareness, and they can use or make tools, but not to the degree that humans have it. But as you can see, they are perfectly happy with the state they live in, hopefully. So let's now look a little more at those artifacts and the symbolic meaning of artifacts. If you take any object, just look around you, find anything and look at it. It could be, I don't know, a cup, it could be a computer, it could be a pot for a house plant, it could be a vase or a lamp or anything. Each time you will be able to deduce a lot of information from those objects, because as you remember, objects can be seen as emissaries of the culture that produced it. So a lot of information can be deduced. The materials, the level of technology necessary to produce those objects. Sometimes more abstract things like religious beliefs of the people that produced it. Very often, if you look at cult objects from distant cultures, you know these are cult objects. So they tell you something about the religious beliefs of the people that produced it. Forms of government, the structure of economy, artistic comprehension and taste. So we have a selection of various objects coming from different cultures here on the slide, and just ask yourself what you can deduce from these objects, like the supermarket trolley or the abstract sculpture, a hand watch, or this rather strange and perhaps the least familiar object here, which actually is a Buddhist prayer tool. So it's used for prayer. So it tells you all kinds of information about the technology, about the economy. Like, you need a supermarket to understand the purpose of this trolley. You need to know something about the Buddhist rituals to understand what this decorative object is. You need to understand the concept of art to understand that this is a sculpture. And every time you can roughly, probably, date the object, you can locate it geographically. It tells you something about the culture that produced it. And the more you are familiar with the culture, the more you can deduce from the object. And this is a good moment to pause the video and to watch a short film or to read a short essay, quite an old one from 1958, but a very famous and influential one, written by an American writer, Leonard E. Read. So his second name was there's just an initial. You'll get the links on Moodle. I think I'll put the name and the title again in the comments. The title of this essay is I Pencil. Pencil, like this. A bit more elaborate one, because the one that has a small eraser at the end as well, but a pencil. This is like a story told from the perspective of the pencil. The pencil is a narrator here. And what would the pencil tell you about his own place in the world? So what can you deduce by looking at a very simple tool, it seems, something ubiquitous, probably more ubiquitous in the 1950s than nowadays? What can you deduce from this simple object? And if you read the essay, or you see a short film inspired by it, you will see that this simple object, as it is, becomes an emissary of the culture that produced it. That is the culture of the 20th century West, with globalization, with mass production, with very advanced and sophisticated technology, but also advanced forms of government, advanced forms of economy. And without all these systems working together, you wouldn't have even a simple thing like a pencil. Again, something to think about. Take anything which you can lay your eyes on now and try to decipher it in a similar manner. Especially something simple. I don't know, a shoe that you're wearing, or some other piece of clothing. Maybe something that is handmade, something that you made perhaps. Would you be able to make it without the entire culture in which we are living? Like, if you knit a sweater, would you have access to the wool, to the yarn, without the culture? Or maybe you would. So that's like the first thinking point for today. All the symbolic aspects of culture that can be deduced from artifacts. And let us now return to the very earliest material culture, the culture of the cavemen, cave people, the early Homo sapiens. And let's return to the question of what was first, culture or civilization. And probably, if we look at very early forms of human endeavor, you will find cave paintings. Cave paintings that date back. Sometimes the oldest examples date back to 35,000 years before. The oldest examples of cave paintings come from northern Spain, the area around the most famous of these caves called Altamira. There are also similar paintings, not as old as the ones in Spain, in France, especially around the cave of Lascaux. Here you have a small map how to situate these places, and here you have some examples of those paintings. They were mostly discovered accidentally. The oldest ones, the ones in Altamira in the late 19th century, the ones in Lascaux in 1940, and they puzzled the world of science. They puzzled the world of culture historians, because they depicted such beautifully rendered animals in a very professional way. What we know about these paintings is that they were painted over many generations on a large scale in almost complete darkness, and they display a great skill of their makers without using sophisticated tools. This is long before pottery, long before agriculture, long before the discovery of metals. So it's made purely by stone tools, or tools made from wood, perhaps from animal bone, perhaps just made by hands, and of course they tell you something about the culture that produced them, not only the immense skill and artistic talent of their makers, but also the culture. Such things had to be produced by a well-organized group of people. They are definitely not the work of one solitary genius. We do not know the purpose. There is no proof of habitation in those caves, so these were not just decorations on your wall where you lived. So probably this is what archaeologists believe. These were ritual sites for some sort of ceremonies, for some sort of probably religious gatherings and practices. There is an interesting film. This is a feature film called Altamira with Antonio Banderas. I put the image here if you're interested, about the whole story of the discovery of the first of such caves and the problems that the man who discovered it by accident faced in his local community, especially from the religious authorities of the local community, the community of the local priests, who could not believe that something like that could be done by those pagans. So these artworks are still influential. As you can see, some examples here on the next slide. The last one is actually a photograph of Pablo Picasso drawing a similar shape of a bull. He was quite fascinated by bulls and bullfighting even. So for him, the image of a bull was the symbol of the power of nature, the power of masculinity as well. So here we have him, the 20th century artist, being inspired by those cave paintings and seeing those animal paintings as something more than just more or less realistic images of animals. So something symbolic, something of spiritual value perhaps as well. So what we have is the question, is cultural progress a result of improving material conditions or not? If you remember last week and the early attempts at creating this kind of evolutionary approach to culture and to development of human societies made by people like Lewis Henry Morgan, if you remember this early anthropologist from the 19th century and his book Ancient Society, he believed that human societies and human culture follows the path of evolution. So we go from savagery to barbarism to civilization. This is the way he described it. And of course, it went without saying then that Western civilization, Anglo-Saxon civilization especially, was considered to be the best. So what would be logical was, let's say, that the easiest, the most basic discoveries, like the discovery of fire, would lead to discovery of something more advanced, like pottery or ironworking or writing. If you have ever played, there is this old computer game, Civilization. And this is a slide showing this sort of progress that you can achieve in the game. So if you discover fire, you can discover other things then. So the game seems to promote this simple evolutionary approach to human culture. So simple discoveries lead to development of more advanced things, like writing. So it goes beyond the material conditions. You can have the whole written culture, but what about those cave paintings? If we look at the quality, artistic and even material quality of these works of art, it's long before the agricultural developments, the first permanent settlements, first villages and towns, which do not go beyond 8,000 years before Common Era. So if we believe the traditional anthropology and archaeology, again, the name that you may find familiar, Vere Gordon Childe and his book Man Makes Himself, the revolutions, the Neolithic revolution, then the urban revolution, then the industrial revolution. Was this really how the world progressed? This was more or less taken for granted until in the middle of the 20th century, a very interesting archaeological site in Turkey. So in this, the place called the Fertile Crescent, where the first human societies started to form, or one of the earliest human societies started to form, and the first evidence of agriculture and settlements and villages and so. So the place called Göbekli Tepe, and you can see the artistic rendition here and a photograph of one of the pillars that were discovered there. It was discovered again accidentally, as these discoveries go, in the 1960s. The excavation and more rigorous study was conducted in the 90s. And so what they found is the world's oldest known megalith, so the stone culture, in 3 layers, with the oldest of them going beyond pottery. It's 10,000 years before Common Era. So this is before the pottery, this is before the towns, this is before agriculture, and probably this was not a settlement, but again a sanctuary, a place of symbolic relevance rather than something connected to daily life. And here we have the archaeologist who led the team, a German archaeologist. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2014. And what he discovered, the way he described it, is he said, first came the temple, then the city. So which chronology is correct? You have the climate change, which leads to agriculture, which leads to settlement, which leads to the growth of material civilization, which leads to the development of non-material culture, or it is the culture, such as religion or art, so basically the expression of ideas, that leads to some form of settlement, which in turn leads to the development of agriculture and then civilization, settlement and civilization. I would say the jury is out. It looks like these processes could happen simultaneously, but then again, is it culture or civilization? I guess nowadays most archaeologists believe it was culture rather than the material development. There is some evidence of that early development, and especially cultural, but also civilizational development, on the British Isles as well. So if you remember if you remember Child, Bear Gordon Child, and his discoveries in the Orkneys, especially the Neolithic village of Skara Brae. This is an image of one of the settlements, one of the houses that Neolithic people lived in. But among the remains of the houses and of the furniture, you can see this kind of shelf visible in the photograph, but on the shelf they found things like this on the photograph below. So mysterious objects carved from stone with great complexity and requiring quite a lot of important were these status symbols? Did they have any practical use? We do not know, really. These were probably as old as the Great Pyramid of Giza, so these are really very ancient things. Another mysterious object is Stonehenge. Not as old as Skara Brae findings, but then again, what was it? Was it a place of gathering? Did it have any religious significance? Was it a place of, earthly power? The place where they crowned their kings? Quite a lot of mysteries. And if you are able to solve these, well, good for you, great. So let's now look at the history of art in Britain, starting with this prehistoric period and then the following periods in British history of art. So let's now look at the very specific type of material culture that is art, artistic expression, and whatever you can find in Britain from different periods, and basically the periodization of art in Britain. So we start with prehistory. You've seen the oldest findings like Skara Brae findings in the Orkneys, and Stonehenge, which is, as you know, in southwestern England. There are also objects that can be seen as equivalent to Stone Age art, like this very ancient image of a horse. Actually, you can see a horse's head quite well here, carved into a piece of bone, animal bone. So maybe it was a tool, maybe it was just the material on which somebody carved a very realistic and well-rendered image of a horse. Or there was something symbolic about horses in early British art, if you think about that, because one of the things that you find in prehistoric art in Britain is the images of horses. Like here we have one of the so-called hill figures, that is the carvings, huge carvings made into the earth of the hills, and visible in its entirety only from the distance. This one is from Oxfordshire, the White Horse. As you can see, it's not very realistic. It's much less realistic than the carving on the bone fragment. It's more abstract, but we can agree it looks like a version of a horse, probably. What was the function? What was the symbolic meaning of this? Hard to say, but definitely it tells you something about the culture that produced it. So what we have here is the emissaries of a culture that is so far back in history that not much of it is known, and sometimes it's only those works of art that survive. So that's the situation really before even antiquity. Most stories of the history of art, also British history of art, start with the ancient Greeks and Romans, so with classical antiquity. But as you know, now there is a long history before it, going all the way to the evolution of the human species, to the first great civilizations of the Fertile Crescent, the great civilization of Egypt, which then in turn give rise to classical antiquity. But if we talk about European civilization and the foundations, symbolic foundations of European civilization, there has been the consensus among the scholars starting from the 19th century mostly, so around the time when anthropology is studied and archaeology is studied, and generally people start to have more interest in the functioning of culture. So there has been a division between the West and the East. The West meaning, of course, the European countries, especially the countries of Western Europe, later also America, North America, and the East. It's quite debatable where the border would go between the West and the East, but the general consensus was that the West was the proper European civilization, civilized, enlightened, and democratic, and the East was barbaric, backward, and despotic. Of course, this has been challenged many times from the 19th century, but I would say it's still some sort of bedrock on which many ideas of modern conservatism especially are grounded, and many modern discussions have their roots in the 19th century, in this division between the West, the civilized West, our West of course, and the barbaric East. Whether this East is China, India, I don't know, Polynesian islands, Africa, or the Slavic lands. So sometimes you have to be quite careful with whom you identify. And the foundations of European civilization, as seen again by 19th century scholars and philosophers and intellectuals, were basically the ideas of classical antiquity. So Greek art, the Roman law, and the Roman structures of the state, and then very quickly Christian religion. So Christian morality especially. Again, this has been challenged. Some people still see it as the grounds of all European civilization. This is something that you have to consider, especially if you do not agree with it. So the idea behind it is that's one vision of civilization and the West. Is it true? Is it still valid in the 21st century? Is it still valid after the globalization, after the fall of colonial powers? We'll probably return to this question many times, but that's the beginning. This is something that we are up against. So if we look at the history of art in Britain, usually we start with the Romans. So Roman art in Britain, you can see the dates here. And what is interesting is that, of course, there was human settlement for centuries and perhaps even millennia before the Romans made large part of Great Britain, their colony called Britannia. But very quickly, British culture and British art, especially as created created by and created for the elite of the society, became a part of a larger whole. So the art of Roman Britain is not really very different from the art of Roman France or the art of any Roman lands in the large Roman Empire. So here we have some examples, all coming from the British Isles. We have the illustrations of classical myths, which the Romans took from the Greeks, actually. So we have the abduction of Europa. So the story of the god Zeus, or Jupiter as the Romans would call him, transforming himself into a white bull and carrying away a beautiful princess. So the images around him are not really angels in the Christian sense. They are amors or eroses, so the personifications of love and desire, which were later borrowed by the Christians in the figure of angels. We have the Roman bath in the city of Bath, which used an earlier hot springs, sulfur springs, which were used as some sort of healing temple. So this wasn't a spa in the modern sense. This was a spiritual site, a kind of temple where people would go for healing in the medicinal waters. We have Hadrian's Wall, so one of the fortifications built by the Romans as borders of the British Empire. So the baths in Bath are not very different from baths in Rome or anywhere else in the Roman world. And what we have here is an interesting moment when Britain is a part of a larger whole, and not even a dominant part. Britain became, its civilized, at least in the 19th century sense, history as a colony rather than a colonizing power. Then we move to the Middle Ages. The medieval art starts after the Romans go away around the year 410 of the Common Era, and they end with the War of the Roses and the destruction of the aristocracy, especially the houses, the royal houses of York and Lancaster, and the coming of the new dynasty, that is the Tudors. But before it happened, lots of interesting cultural artifacts and buildings and historical monuments are there to be seen, mostly being very visible emissaries of medieval culture for whom there were two great powers, the church and religion and the king. So what we have are mostly cathedrals and castles. Cathedrals, the most beautiful and elaborate are the cathedrals in the Gothic style, like Canterbury Cathedral. The castles, one of the best preserved and still used more or less in the original function, is the Tower of London, built for the Normans. We have the tales of chivalry, we have the tales of martyrdom, we have all kinds of stories of conquest and warfare and honor, and this is all part of the medieval culture. So it's expressed through architecture, as you can see here, but also other works of art, such as the first preserved books, mostly gospel books, such as here Lindisfarne Gospels from the monastery on the island of Lindisfarne in northern England. If you look close, this is a decorated page with an initial, with the kind of very beautifully decorated first letter of the chapter of New Testament. And if you look close, you can see it combines the Christian message with earlier, in this case, Celtic visual language. The very intricate geometric lines and very elaborate symbolism that was there before the Romans, and even not only in Great Britain but in this whole part of the world, like Ireland. If you ever go to Dublin, go and see the Book of Kells, or Google it, the Book of Kells. Beautiful, quite similar, perhaps even more elaborate and better preserved than the Lindisfarne Gospels, combining the modern, at this point, Christian message with older Celtic tradition and older Celtic visual language. We have another wonderful work of art, which is the Bayeux Tapestry, which is an embroidered story, handcrafted embroidered story of the Norman conquest, of the Battle of Hastings, and basically how King or Prince William the Bastard of Normandy became King William the Conqueror of England. So what we have are real medieval stories. No princesses here and no dragons. What we have are men fighting for the crown. That's the real Game of Thrones, if you think about that. We have quite a lot of historical events happening in the medieval period. So we won't go into that. We will just focus on art today. But this art and this culture is still an inspiration, or has been inspirational for generations of artists and writers and intellectuals ever since. And here you have two examples of late 19th century paintings inspired by those earlier times. So we have one late 19th century painting showing the imagined scene in a Roman bath, this time bath of Caracalla in Rome, but I would say probably the functioning of the Roman baths in Bath were quite similar. And we also have an image of Christianization of England here, the same year, a similar style, late Victorian academic style, but this time we have the monk who is Saint Augustine, finding a group of beautiful blonde-haired children in Rome being sold as slaves, and according to the legend he asked, who are these people, where are they from? And he was told that these were Anglo-Saxons, so Angli. And he reacted, they are not Anglo-Saxons, they are not Angli, they are angels. So here we have what he apparently, according to the legend, said in Latin, non-Angli said Angeli, and this is apparently what made him take the job to go to the Anglo-Saxons and to spread Christianity there. So then what we have in the history of art in Britain is what is generally called the early modern period. After the end of the Middle Ages, so after the end of the Wars of the Roses, and before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is the second half of the 18th century. So whatever happened between the end of the Wars of the Roses, the Battle of Hastings, and the Tudor dynasty comes to the throne with the person of King Henry VII, the father of the famous Henry VIII, to the Industrial Revolution and what followed the loss of American colonies in 1776, the French Revolution in 1789. All that happens between these two events is called the early modern period. So if you ever heard about early modern history, early modern literature, early modern art, that's it. And here we have some things that happened not only in Britain but generally in Europe. So that's when the Italian Renaissance happens. The end of the Spanish Reconquista, so they take the Iberian Peninsula back from the Muslims. Christopher Columbus's voyages and geographic exploration. The Protestant Reformation in German-speaking countries. This is before the unification of Germany. And in England, the 30 Years' War in Germany, the Civil War in England, with Oliver Cromwell, followed by the restoration of monarchy, the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century, and the beginning of the British colonial expansion, especially in North America, but later also in Asia. This is all happening in the early modern period. You do not have to memorize it. I'm just giving you the list to kind of ground you in the general historical perspective. Because if we talk about art in Britain and the history of art, starting with the beginning of the early modern period, so when the medieval period ends, the usual way of naming those periods in art history is to name them after the dynasties that sat on the throne. So we have Tudor art, we have Stuart art. The Tudor art basically is the 16th century, if you think about it. So, of course, it starts with Henry VII. It continues through the reign of Henry VIII, all the way to Elizabeth. So, 3 generations of monarchs. This is the time of Renaissance, of the opening of Britain to Western European artistic and intellectual influence. One of the greatest artists of this period is actually an immigrant, the immigrant from the German-speaking countries, Hans Holbein. And here we have some examples of his work for King Henry VIII, especially, and his court. So a very famous painting, double portrait called The Ambassadors, and one of the many portraits, this time a full figure portrait of King Henry VIII. And they are very realistic. They are really interested in the human side of things, so the physical realism, but also they are imbued with a lot of symbolism, starting with the pose in which the king is shown, standing very straight, standing very tall and powerful, and looking quite imposing. If we look at the ambassadors, and if you do not know this painting, absolutely Google it and perhaps see a documentary about it, so you will see all the complex symbols included in this painting, and the way that they comment not only on the people presented here, so the foreign ambassadors at the court of Henry VIII, but also the new way of life, Renaissance, humanism, the geographic exploration, the role of arts and science, intellectual pursuits. And very interestingly, if you look at this strange shape, oval, kind of oblong shape at the bottom of the painting, what this is, if you do not know it, Google it. I will not tell you now, I don't want to spoil it for you. If you know what this is, again, this is probably the most powerful symbol of them all. After the Tudors die out, so Queen Elizabeth dies leaving no immediate heir, the new dynasty is invited to the throne. So the Stuarts, the Stuarts were the royal dynasty from Scotland. They were relatives of the Tudors through the female line and through marriage. So when Queen Elizabeth died, she left her throne to James I of England, who was actually James VI of Scotland. So we have the first moment of unification of England and Scotland under one dynasty, the Stuarts. And we have the Stuart art in Britain, which more or less corresponds to the 17th century. So the Tudors are the 16th century and the Stuarts are the 17th century. We have another great foreign artist forming a close collaboration with the monarch. So we have Sir Anthony van Dyck, a Flemish artist who came to Britain, who even became knighted. That's why Sir Anthony. And he made his name producing lots of portraits of King Charles I, and he faced a completely opposite problem as Holbein had with Henry VIII, because Charles I was actually very delicately built and rather short, so the way to present him as an imposing monarch was done through, for example, putting him on a horse. So that's what you have here. So this is more or less the time when in Europe we have the Renaissance and the Baroque. And of course we can talk about English Renaissance as the intellectual movement with great minds such as Isaac Newton, the great scientist and intellectual, and also William Shakespeare. We have some of the elements of architecture being relatively similar in Britain than in other parts of Western Europe. Like here we have one palace, Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, which is very much in the Renaissance style, especially the fact that it's not supposed to be a castle for defense, but rather a palace for pleasure. So they had the popular saying went, Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall, because that's what you have, a pleasure palace. The same with Baroque. It more or less corresponds with the Stuart period, and what we have is similar trends in art, and even similar artists like Peter Paul Rubens producing works for the royal court. We have Baroque architecture, like most visibly St. Paul's Cathedral, made by Sir Christopher Wren, to actually compete with St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. So the great Protestant answer to one of the greatest Catholic Renaissance structures in the Western world. We have similar fashions, like here we have the back of a chair in the Rococo style. So Britain is part of the Western culture, Western civilization, with some local elements thrown in. A very important moment in history is 1666, the Great Fire of London, where a large part of the city is destroyed and then had to be rebuilt in the modern style. Modern, of course, for the 17th century. So we continue in a moment. So the next part, so if you remember, Tudor art means more or less the equivalent of Renaissance. Stuart art means more or less the equivalent of Baroque. What will happen in the 18th century? So again, a new dynasty. The Stuarts die out, leaving no heirs. The last Stuart monarch is Queen Anne, and after her death in 1714, a new dynasty is invited to the throne of Great Britain, so the united England and Scotland. And this is the Hanoverian dynasty. They are the closest surviving Protestant, this is important, Protestant relatives of the Stuarts, and they are invited by the Parliament. So what we have is a new form of government, parliamentary monarchy, developing at the same time as artistic styles go. So in the 18th century, we'll basically have what might be called Hanoverian art, but usually it is called Georgian. The reason behind it is that the first four kings from the Hanoverian dynasty to sit on the British throne were all called George. George I, George II, George III, George IV. And their rule spans almost the whole of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. So Georgian art in Britain means the period of the reign of the Hanoverian dynasty before Queen Victoria comes to the throne in 1837. It's quite a long period, as you can see. Sometimes it's seen as, it's called the long 18th century. Some of the centuries in Britain lasted longer than others. So there is this concept of the early modern period, which is, Georgian art kind of falls partially into that. We have the long 18th century and we have the long 19th century. We'll talk about it in a little moment. So Georgian art in Britain, it corresponds more or less to the classicist period in Europe. So we have the greater interest in classical antiquity, in the inspirations in architecture, in inspiration in design, in fashion as well, as you'll see in a moment. This is reflected to some extent in Britain as well. For example, the British Museum opens in 1753. We have also some great masters of design like Josiah Wedgwood, and this whole trend in pottery, so in making vases, which are of course made in Britain from British materials, but they are stylistically inspired by classical antiquity. There is a greater interest in the people, especially in the developing city life. We have the first artist, which is sometimes called the first British artist to become national superstar. And here we have another cat. That's Minnie. In 18th century, people also start keeping pets. So, yeah, Minnie. William Hogarth. And if you look at the art of William Hogarth, he did not work for the kings and queens. He did not even work for the aristocracy that much. What he was really interested is the daily life of people living in the city, especially in London. So what he specialized in was something that you might call a predecessor of a comic book or a graphic novel. So paintings in cycles, so cycles of paintings that tell a story, usually a moral story, like here, The Rake's Progress. So the story of a young man who was lazy and immoral, and he inherited a lot of money from his relatives, and of course he didn't use this money wisely, and basically he squandered the money and destroyed his life in the process. This is a completely new thing, to tell a story through paintings. So basically to use them as a tool of narration. In the Georgian period, especially towards the end of the 18th century, we also have possibly the one type of art, one form of graphic art that was ever originated, invented first in Britain. And this is the political caricature. Everything else they adapted from Europe. But political caricature appears to be a very British invention. And here we have a caricature of the Prince of Wales, the later King George IV, or the last of the first four Georges, by one of the masters of the genre from the turn of the 19th century, James Gillray. The last part of the Georgian period in Britain is sometimes called the Regency era, because of this ridiculed, gluttonous and spendthrift Prince of Wales. Before he became George IV, so while his father George III was still alive, there was a period of regency. From 1811 to 1820, the old king, George III, died in 1820, but before that he became very ill, especially with some sort of mental disorder. So he famously went mad. There is this film, The Madness of King George. It's about precisely this moment when King George III had this mysterious and rather frightening mental collapse. And the Parliament, it's the Parliament again, invited the Prince of Wales, so the heir to the throne, to take the role of the Prince Regent, that is, to actually reign in place of his father, in the name of his father, while he was too ill to fulfill any of the official functions. And this happened in 1811 and lasted till the death of the king in 1820. But sometimes, in terms of cultural studies and in terms of art history, the Regency era is also extended. So it's more or less the period from the Napoleonic Wars, so after the aftermath of the French Revolution, to the accession of Queen Victoria, the niece of George IV, who came to the throne after he died childless, and after his younger brother William, who ruled for 10 years as William the Fourth, seven, yes, from 1830 to 1837. Victoria was the daughter of yet another younger brother, so that's why she came to the throne quite unexpectedly as a very young woman of 18 in 1837. So the period from the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars mostly, and till the accession of Victoria is sometimes called the Regency era, including the actual period when the Prince of Wales ruled as Prince Regent. Many interesting things happen here politically, like the Great Reform Act, which changed the voting system for the Parliament. We have a lot of interesting books being published, some of them by women, like all the novels of Jane Austen are happening in the Regency era, and also Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So we have the beginning of the Gothic novel, which is very interesting, especially if you compare it with a rather rationalist approach of the classicists. So we have this kind of tension and undercurrent in British culture. Here we have a fashion plate, so an illustration from a fashion magazine showing a fashionable dress of the Regency period, which is at least partially inspired by classical antiquity. So kind of long flowing lines. The women are almost like columns draped in those flowing gowns. A very interesting period in British culture, and a very fruitful period in British culture as well. Then what we have is Victorian era. So the reign of just one queen, but this was the record-breaking reign at that time. She sat on the throne for more than 63 years. So she came to the throne at 18 in 1837, and she died in January of 1901. So very conveniently, most of the 19th century falls into her reign, the reign of Queen Victoria. So what we have is Victorian art, and whatever happens in this period is sometimes called the Victorian period, Victorian culture. This is the time of massive changes in the society, in the lifestyle, so urbanization, in the economy, so industrialization, the results of the Industrial Revolution are basically felt in everyday life of everybody. There is a lot of technological progress, but also some elements of intellectual life which are still visible in modern and even postmodern, contemporary discussions, intellectual discussions. So what we have here is the Crystal Palace, like a giant glass house of 1851, which housed the Great Exhibition in London, which was like the very first expo, showing all kinds of interesting things, objects brought from all around the British Empire. So we have the beginning of globalized culture, we have the beginning of the consumer culture, of very urban lifestyle. This was of course in London, in Hyde Park. But if we look at Victorian art, especially the mainstream art, there is a lot of nostalgia, and this is the kind of nostalgia that is now felt sometimes towards the 19th century. They had the same nostalgia towards earlier periods. So here we have, for example, a late Victorian painting illustrating Ophelia, one of the main characters of Shakespeare's Hamlet. But here, of course, the question of a woman, the question of a young woman losing her mind and committing suicide, somehow resonates with the Victorians. Why would it? Is it the nostalgia? Is it the high social value, kind of culture capital, if you think, if you quote Bourdieu, of Shakespeare? Perhaps, or there is even something deeper in Victorian lifestyle and Victorian frame of mind, and this is the dualities, the way of thinking based on oppositions. So the oppositions between anything, the individual versus the society, the mind versus the material world, the inner psychological reality, the external material social world, the uncanny versus the familiar, so the unfamiliar versus the familiar, femininity versus masculinity, the city versus nature, mysticism versus rationalism. So this very strictly defined dual way of thinking. So modernity versus tradition. They even have the two-party system, not the Conservatives and the Labour Party as we have in Britain today, but Conservatives are the same Conservatives, but the Liberal Party is the second one, so it's kind of more to the right still, but the dualities as the framework for thinking, this is absolutely the legacy of the Victorians. Here we have two images of the two great landscape painters of the 19th century, of the first half of the 19th century, but still, John Constable and Joseph Mallord William Turner. And you just see it, the duality in thinking. So probably some of the best known and best loved paintings, the Hay Wain by Constable and Rain, Steam and Speed by Turner. One shows the traditional world of rural life in a more or less traditional manner. We don't have time to discuss it right now, but as you can see, it's more realist. The other one, Turner's Rain, Steam and Speed, celebrates modernity. It's quite hazy, you cannot really see very well what's there. It's a good idea to Google it and to see the painting in a good resolution, kind of try to take a close-up view. Because then you notice it's a celebration of a train, of a steam-powered locomotive rushing towards the viewer. So the contrast between modernity and tradition, the old world and new technologies rushing in. The old world of certainties, of beauty, of spiritualism, and all the traditional things, and modernity as something powerful and perhaps fascinating, perhaps a bit frightening. And if you have those polarizing views that are so present in the contemporary world, they are usually quite easy to be taken back to the Victorians. They are somehow rooted in the Victorian way of thinking through dualities. What happens later is the modern and postmodern art in Britain. We don't really have time to discuss it, and we'll talk about the questions of modernity and postmodernity later on. So just to give you the idea how some artists initiate a discussion with history, with tradition, with some cultural motives. So here we have one of the paintings or fragment of a painting, three studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion by Francis Bacon, one of the modern artist. As you can see, it's something that perhaps could illustrate hell, something that Hieronymus Bosch could paint as an image of hell rather than the figures at the base of a crucifixion. But of course, this is, as you can see, made in 1944, just as the Second World War was raging. So it's a commentary not only on the Christian tradition and this image of suffering embodied by crucifixion, but also the reality of the war, the reality of the modern world, the tragedy and despair of human life. Perhaps even, if you know anything about the artist's biography, his own depression and his own despair in life. And then we have the postmodern work, The Diamond Skull, whose official title is For the Love of God, made in 2007 by Damien Hirst. So it's basically a human skull studded with diamonds. What is it? What does it tell you? What is the symbolic meaning of this work of art? Is it the consumerism? Is it the egoism of contemporary people? Is it the way that modern people want to see themselves as masters of creation, as gods in some sort of way? Is it some sort of ironic commentary? I'm not going to answer these questions, and definitely you can see there is quite a lot of playfulness and perhaps some scathing critique of art, of culture, of history, and something that we'll definitely return to when we talk about modernism and postmodernism. So the last slide for today is a quote from a writer, L.P. Hartley. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So if you want to understand the past, you have to remember that not only the material reality expressed through artifacts was different, but also the way of thinking was different. So that's it for today, and see you next time.